We're inside of the Develop module of Lightroom, and I'm going to show you one of my favorite techniques for using maximum detail. I call it my high impact workflow. Okay, now I'm going to be using some very generous settings here, but you can be a little bit more conservative once you've discovered the workflow for yourself. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually crop this image. There's a little bit too much negative space going on here, and a little bit of interference at the edges and in this bottom left hand corner, which I'm not happy with. So I'm just going to come in with the crop overlay, press R on the keyboard if you like, and then we're just going to come in and create a much tighter crop. Okay, I'm going to remove that information from the bottom left hand side here. Okay, and come in perhaps a little bit closer here. Again, we're using that crop overlay. You can press the O key in order to get alternative crop overlays here, and I'm preferring the one that just allows me to put this line through the center of the key character inside of this image. I might come in just a little bit tighter again on both sides there. Okay, now we've got that crop that I'm looking for. I'm just going to press the R key or click on the crop overlay in order to apply that crop. Okay, the next stages I'm going to do is I'm going to expand the contrast and get maximum information from this information. Before I do that, I'm going to come in with a graduated filter, which has got this very bright area here. I think there's some folded up tables here, but it's too bright for the image, so I want to pull a little bit of detail and texture. We can see it's not actually clipping inside of the file, it's just a little bit too bright. So I'm going to come down with perhaps a negative exposure, and I'll even try some highlights here, bringing that down by 60 or 70 or so. If these aren't the perfect settings, we'll find out sooner or later as we apply this graduated filter, and then we can fine tune those settings to taste. I'm just going to click inside of the center area here and then drag over to the left hand side of the image. Just holding down the shift key will constrain that graduated filter to a perfect vertical, and we're getting a lot more information now. I can pull the exposure and see if we get a little bit more. That's probably a little bit too much, so I'm just going to back that up to about 1/3 of a stop, and the highlights are giving me the effect that I need, just a maximum amount of information there. Okay, I don't want it too dark, I just don't want it glaringly bright. Okay, now I've added that graduated filter. I'll just click on that in order to come out, and we're back in the basic panel now. Okay, now don't be too alarmed with some of the settings I'm about to use. We're going to max out quite a lot of these sliders. Okay, so we're going to drag the highlight slider all the way down to -100 here. Again, getting extra detail into those highlighter regions, and take out the shadows to +100. Okay, we're also going to add +100 on the contrast and +100 on the clarity, and we'll take that black slider also up to, yes, you've guessed it, +100 here. Now a couple of the sliders that will be subjective to the image that you're actually working on, or specific to the image you're working on, are the following sliders here. Exposure, the whole thing's gone a little bit too bright for this particular image. Now in other images it might be the right setting, but we're going to have to come down perhaps by as much as a stop in order to recover information. Now what tends to happen with the color saturation inside of this technique is it climbs a little bit too high, so I'm going to use a -50 value on that vibrant slider, just to sort of calm down the color there. Now for a lot of images that we're working on that are not too high contrast to begin with, these are the sorts of settings that I'd be looking for before moving to the next step. However, it's just a little bit too high in contrast for me. Some of the shadows are still a little bit too dark, even though we've got the shadows maxed out at +100, and some of the highlights are still a little bit too bright. Okay, so I'm going to come in to the tone curve. Now I always use this as a secondary point for editing tone inside of an image. I generally use or favor the tone sliders, as these are a lot more effective at working with our image tone than the curves. But I am actually going to use this in order to create a lower contrast image. Now you can work and just pull down the highlights and open up the shadows. If you're a little bit more unfamiliar with curves, then what I'm going to suggest you do is you will, I'll just set this back to linear so there's no adjustment there, is to come back to what we call the parametric curve. I just clicked on this little icon down here, and then I'm just going to pull the highlights out to a position of 85 and pull down the shadows down to a position of 15 or so. And being a little bit stubborn, wants to be 16 there for some reason. And now we're going to pull the highlights down. Okay, this is going to pull in extra information into those bright highlights, and we're going to open up the shadows. Perhaps 70 to 80 on each of those should give me the extra detail that I'm looking for before moving to the next step. Okay, this technique also tends to exaggerate image artifacts and noise, even though that we're shooting with a moderate ISO of 500 here on a sensor which is a very good sensor for raising the ISO. This technique does tend to exaggerate the image noise inside of a file. So I'm going to come over to the Detail tab, and I'm going to leave the sharpening at 25, but I'm going to mask the smoother areas that don't need to be sharpened at all just by holding down the Alt key on a PC or the Option key on a Mac. I'm just going to click and drag that up probably to around 40 to 50. Is just going to smooth out some of those areas so that will suppress the noise in the smoother tone areas. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add some noise reduction. We're just going to add 20 into that noise reduction, and again that will help to suppress the information. We can actually zoom into 1:1 view in order to see what's happening here, or I can get a clear idea of what's happening inside of this little panel. We can also toggle on and off to see the excess noise there, and with our adjustments it's just coming a little bit cleaner through our work there. Okay, we're almost ready now to move over into the next step. As you can see, as I click on each of the panels, other panels open and close, and that is because I'm in solo mode. Just right click. This is especially useful if you're working on a laptop to be able to open and collapse panels automatically. Okay, now that we've finished the basic edit inside of Lightroom here, I'm going to take the image out inside of into the main editing space of Photoshop. There's one thing I'm thinking of doing before I'm going to do that, however, and again this is a subjective adjustment, but I'm going to come down to the effects, and I'm just going to add a small amount of vignetting into this image, maybe -20, just to darken down those corners, just so we can pull focus in towards the center of the image. Occasionally when you do this post-crop vignetting here, you might need to make a smaller adjustment to the brightness again in order to bring back the vitality of this image. I'm just going to right click inside of this image now and come down to Edit In, and just edit in whichever version of Photoshop you're currently using. I'm currently using with the new Photoshop CC, so I'll click on this one. And this will take the image out into the main editing space of Photoshop. Okay, and I'll just fit on screen there. Use a keyboard shortcut, Command 0 on a Mac or Control 0 on a PC to fit in view there. Now, if you've brought this in as a smart object, okay, I've actually brought this in as a rendered layer, we are actually going to have to convert this into a smart object. We can come to the filter menu and choose convert for smart filters. As I said, if you'd have already brought this in as a smart object, you wouldn't need to actually do that particular step. Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to apply a smart filter. We're going to come up to the filter menu, come down to blur, and then choose Gaussian blur. Now the precise value of Gaussian blur that you're going to be choosing here will really depend on the subject, but a really good starting point is a radius value of around about 10, I find. If you're working with much higher resolution images with larger shapes, then you can probably increase the radius. Or if you're working with a more detailed image with smaller shapes, then you could lower the radius. Okay, but again, 10 is a good starting point. We're working with a 24 megapixel sensor here, but I've cropped it down probably to about 16 megapixels here in that initial crop. Okay, so we'll select OK to apply that Gaussian blur globally to the image. We're now going to come to the smart filter. Okay, you can see the Gaussian blur on the smart filters here, and if we move our mouse cursor over to the right side, we'll have a blending options icon. What I want to do is I want to double click on that blending options because I want to set the mode of this Gaussian blur to overlay. Okay, now this will mix the blur in with the image. Okay, and what we're going to do now is we're going to save this file and go back inside of Lightroom to finish the processing. Okay, so we just need to Command S on a Mac or Control S on a PC in order to save this work, and then Command W on a Mac or Control W on a PC to close this file. Now I'm just going to switch back to my Lightroom, and you'll see the edited image appears back inside of the Lightroom catalog. That's because when we save by default we didn't specify where we were saving to, so by default it saves to the same file that the original raw file is sitting in. We're now going to make some adjustments in order to fine-tune this image. Again, the contrast has crept a little bit high because of that blend mode, the overlay blend mode, which is a contrast blend mode. So although it gave us some nice smooth tone with that rich detail, it has raised saturation and contrast. And so what I can do is I can lower that contrast slider. Here I'll choose a value of -50. You could go a little bit further if you like. The highlights again are getting a little bit bright, so I'm going to pull those highlights down, and the shadows again are getting a little bit dark, so I'm going to pull those out. Okay, and the exposure is probably a little bit bright, so I'm going to come down with the exposure, and again the vibrance has gone a little bit high, so again pulling that down. Okay, so your precise values for finishing this file off will be quite subjective again. I'm going to pull that exposure down just a little bit more, and I'm now going to do an edge burn effect using the effects. Now again I've got a preset for this edge burn, so I'm just going to come out to that left panel and click on my presets, and we'll come down to the prime presets where this edge burn. Okay, we've got two versions of the edge burn. One is a little bit darker and one is a little bit more subtle. I'll go for the darker one, the ESP border edge burn. Okay, and that just darkens off the edges of this image nicely here. Okay, now if that's not enough detail for you, for many people that was probably a little bit too much detail, but if that's not enough detail we can also come back in and push that clarity slider a little bit more, but I'll just zero out. I'm actually quite happy with the way this image is performing. Maybe a little bit more color, restore a little bit more color to this file. Okay, so I'll show you the edge burn settings, which is in the effects panel. You can see that I've pulled I'm working with highlight priority down -50. The midpoint is set to 0. The roundness is set to -90, and the feather is set to 100. And if I just click on and off that effect, you can see it's just pulling down the darkening of the edges of that file, again focusing our attention on that image. Okay, and that is the finished project. If I just go back into grid view just by pressing the G key, you'll see we have the edited version. This is now being re-imported as a TIFF. Okay, and if I go back to grid, we can see the original master DNG file we started from. And if I press D on the keyboard to go into develop and choose reset, that was the starting point for the image. Okay, and let's just take a look at the finishing point. There we go. We could do a side-by-side comparison of the two versions here. Okay, I'll just hit the tab key to hide those two side panels, and we'll just do a side-by-side comparison before and after. And as you can see, our process version has a lot of extra detail. Just look at the detail in the fabric and the newspaper and his beard and his hair, and even the texture in the wall. Everything has been expanded beautifully. For those of you who are working with the CC version of Photoshop, there is a slightly alternative technique that you can use on this effect. Okay, now here's the start image that we worked, and this is the version that we cropped, and then we added that graduated filter on the right hand side to pull down those highlights, and then we use those maximum impact settings in the basic panel. All of those settings set to the hundreds that we had working there in order to give ourselves maximum detail. And this is the point where we went into Photoshop to add the Gaussian blur. Okay, now this is where the technique is going to differ for CC users who want to explore this non-destructive approach to this technique. We will simply right click, go to editing, and this time I'm going to open as Smart Object in Photoshop. This will embed this raw file into a layer inside of Photoshop. Okay, and here we have the high impact file that we had inside of the Lightroom, and the raw file has been embedded inside of here. Now we can double click on this smart object, and this will open the file inside of Adobe Camera Raw, and we can see all of the settings that we applied inside of Lightroom. I won't need to make any of the adjustments here. I'll just cancel that out. Okay. The next part of the process is actually the same as the previous process. We just go to filter and then choose that Gaussian blur. Now this is the last filter I use with that 10 pixel Gaussian blur setting, so I'll just select that as the last filter I used and select OK again. And then we set the mode of that Gaussian blur to overlay, and then selected OK. And now this is where the workflow differs. What we're going to do now is, instead of closing this file and continue working inside of Lightroom, we're going to finish this project off inside of Photoshop CC. We're going to go to Filter, and this is a new Camera Raw filter. Okay, this takes the processed version inside of Adobe Camera Raw. As you can see, we're not seeing any of the settings that we applied for Lightroom, because this is a combined version of the raw file and the Gaussian blur applied in blend mode. And now we can set about making some of those settings that we used to do before, like lowering the contrast perhaps, and adjusting the exposure slightly, bringing down the highlights, maybe opening up the shadows in order to get that effect. We could also come into the effects and maybe add in that little bit of edge burn effect that we were looking for. Okay, where we set the feather to a maximum and the roundness down, and then choose the midpoint for the most appropriate edge burn effect. Okay, and just bringing that down a little bit. Okay, and I'll take that as the edge burn effect for in this instance, and we'll just apply OK. I think I'll just take down the vibrance as well, as that was climbing a little bit high, and then select OK. And as you can see, we've finished this project up inside of Photoshop CC now, instead of going and doing the finishing work inside of Lightroom. The options that we get, the increased options we get here, is we can change the stacking order of these effects. Okay, we've got the Gaussian blur that we originally applied to get the smoother tone down sitting at the bottom, but I can click on this Gaussian blur and then move that higher in the stack. Okay, and just let go as it goes above the camera raw filter, and this will give us variations that we can start playing with inside of Photoshop. Okay, we've got the edge burn effect, but I'm actually wanting a little bit more of that vignetting, and because I open this up as a smart object, I can just double click on that smart object, come into my effects and increase the amount of vignetting inside of this file, bringing it down perhaps as much as -40 or 50, and selecting OK, and watching this file update inside of Photoshop CC. Okay, so quite quickly there you can see probably there's a few advantages into working in this completely non-destructive workflow, because we can have all of these settings working independently of each other. And if we want to go back and maybe take out that edge burn effect, which maybe is not appropriate anymore, or lower the darkness of that, then I can just come back into the camera raw filter and choose the effects, and then lower that edge burn effect just to a much more subtle amount, and again watch the file update. Okay, so as you can see, a slightly alternative workflow to the original one outlined.